What happens when one of the world's poorest countries tells wealthy nations to keep their money? In 2023, Burkina Faso made headlines by doing exactly that, sparking a global conversation that exposed uncomfortable truths about foreign aid, sovereignty, and the complex relationship between Africa and the West. The reactions were swift, dramatic, and revealed just how much this decision challenged the established order of international relations. Picture this: a landlocked nation in West Africa where millions struggle with poverty and food insecurity, suddenly announcing they no longer want assistance from their former colonial masters and traditional donors. The audacity of this move sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, aid organizations, and media outlets worldwide. But why did Burkina Faso make this bold decision? And more importantly, how did the world respond? To understand the magnitude of these reactions, we need to grasp what Burkina Faso was rejecting. For decades, this nation had been a recipient of billions in foreign aid, development assistance, and humanitarian support. International organizations, European governments, and NGOs had established deep roots in the country, funding everything from healthcare programs to educational initiatives. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government announced they were reassessing these relationships and potentially cutting ties with traditional donors, it wasn't just a policy change, it was a direct challenge to the entire aid industry. The immediate reaction from Western governments was one of surprise mixed with concern. French officials, whose country had maintained significant influence in its former colony, expressed dismay at what they termed an unfortunate decision. The French Foreign Ministry released carefully worded statements emphasizing their commitment to helping the Burkinabe people, while simultaneously warning about the potential humanitarian consequences of rejecting established aid channels. European Union representatives took a more diplomatic approach, with officials stating they remained open to dialogue while expressing hope that Burkina Faso would reconsider. The EU had been one of the largest contributors to development programs in the region, and losing this partnership represented a significant shift in their West African strategy. However, beneath the diplomatic language was clear frustration at losing influence in a strategically important region. The United States' reaction was notably restrained, with State Department officials emphasizing their respect for national sovereignty while expressing concern for the welfare of ordinary citizens. American aid to Burkina Faso had been substantial, focusing primarily on security cooperation and development assistance. The measured response suggested Washington was carefully weighing its options, perhaps recognizing that heavy-handed criticism might push Burkina Faso further away from Western influence. International aid organizations found themselves in a particularly challenging position. Major NGOs and humanitarian groups had built extensive operations in Burkina Faso over many years, employing thousands of local staff and serving millions of beneficiaries. Their reactions ranged from attempts at constructive engagement to barely concealed panic about losing access to communities they had served for generations. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund responded with characteristic institutional caution, emphasizing their commitment to supporting development while noting their respect for each country's right to determine its own path. However, behind closed doors, these institutions were reportedly scrambling to understand how this decision might affect ongoing projects and future lending relationships. African reactions painted a much more complex picture. Several neighboring countries watched with interest, some viewing Burkina Faso's decision as courageous, while others worried about potential economic consequences. Ghana's government expressed solidarity with their neighbors' right to self-determination while maintaining their own relationships with international donors. Nigeria took a more neutral stance, emphasizing regional cooperation regardless of individual aid policies. South African officials praised Burkina Faso's assertion of sovereignty, with some government ministers drawing parallels to their own post-apartheid experience of charting an independent course. This support resonated across much of southern and eastern Africa, where many countries had experienced their own tensions with conditional aid programs. The reaction from civil society organizations was particularly fascinating to observe. While many Western-based advocacy groups expressed concern about potential impacts on vulnerable populations, African civil society painted a more nuanced picture. Some organizations supported the decision as a necessary step toward true independence, while others worried about immediate humanitarian consequences. Media coverage revealed stark differences in perspective depending on geographic location. Western media outlets generally framed the story as a concerning development, focusing on potential negative consequences and questioning the wisdom of rejecting assistance. Headlines emphasized risk, instability, and potential humanitarian crisis. European newspapers were particularly critical, with some articles suggesting that rejecting aid was essentially rejecting help for the country's most vulnerable citizens. African media coverage told a dramatically different story. Many outlets celebrated the decision as a bold assertion of sovereignty and self-determination. Opinion pieces praised Burkina Faso for breaking free from what many African intellectuals have long criticized as neo-colonial dependency relationships. The contrast in coverage was so stark, it seemed like different events were being reported. Social media reactions were equally polarized, but provided fascinating insights into public opinion. Twitter and Facebook discussions revealed deep divisions, with supporters praising Burkina Faso's courage while critics predicted disaster. Hashtags supporting the decision trended across French-speaking Africa, while counter-narratives emphasized the potential human cost of rejecting assistance. Perhaps most interestingly, the reaction from other aid recipient countries was closely watched by development professionals worldwide. Would other nations follow Burkina Faso's example? Several countries in the region began publicly questioning their own aid relationships, suggesting that Burkina Faso's decision had opened a broader conversation about dependency and sovereignty. The economic reaction was immediate and revealing. International investors expressed uncertainty about the country's future direction, while some African development banks indicated increased interest in supporting Burkina Faso's independent path. This split in economic sentiment highlighted the fundamental tension between traditional aid relationships and emerging South-South cooperation models. Religious organizations, which had played significant roles in aid delivery, found themselves navigating complex terrain, while many faith-based groups expressed commitment to continuing their work regardless of government policy. Some worried about access and operational challenges. The diversity of reactions within religious communities reflected broader disagreements about the relationship between aid, development, and dignity. Academic reactions were particularly thoughtful, with development economists and African studies scholars engaging in nuanced debates about the long-term implications. Some praised Burkina Faso for challenging outdated aid models, while others warned about potential negative consequences for human development indicators. This scholarly discourse provided important context, often missing from immediate political and media reactions. The international community's response ultimately revealed more about global power dynamics than about Burkina Faso itself. Traditional donors struggled to understand how a country could reject assistance, while emerging powers saw an opportunity to demonstrate alternative partnership models. This reaction pattern suggested that Burkina Faso had touched a nerve in the international system. As months passed, the initial shock gave way to more measured assessments. Some countries began exploring middle ground approaches that respected Burkina Faso's sovereignty while maintaining engagement opportunities. Others doubled down on criticism, suggesting that rejecting aid was ultimately harmful to ordinary citizens. The world's reaction to Burkina Faso's aid rejection exposed fundamental questions about agency, dignity, and development that continue reverberating today. Whether you view their decision as courageous self-determination or dangerous idealism, one thing is clear. Burkina Faso forced the international community to confront uncomfortable questions about power, dependency, and what true partnership actually means. The global response revealed just how challenging it is for the international system to accept when countries choose to chart their own course, regardless of the consequences.